and this is the US Victoria Forum covering off defence in depth. So this is the second of a four-part webinar series. So hope you made the first one, and there's two more after this one. I'd just like to make note that obviously this session is being recorded for everyone's notice, and also during the webinar, if you have any questions at all, we'd love for you to put them in the chat, and we'll address them towards the tail end of the session. The Q&A will also take place after the Leidos and Senetas sessions, and these can be submitted anonymously. Now, I'd really like to give a really warm welcome to the speakers who've made a amazing effort to come along today, which is Millie Keating, who's on the board at the Defence Council of Victoria, David Hyams, who's the head of cyber operations at Leidos Australia, Andrew Wilson, who's the CEO at Senetas, and Julian, who's the CTO and also co-founder of Senetas as well. They've been very gracious with their time to speak with us all today, and I'm sure they're going to have some wonderful insight to share with us as well. I'd just like to give a quick hand over to Daniel Halpin, who's from the Global Victoria. He'll be able to provide an outline of the US trade program and the webinar series in more detail, and then we'll start getting into the session itself.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Michael. And hello from a surprisingly mild Washington, D.C. Firstly, as we're all based in different places, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands in which we're meeting. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the elders of other communities who may be here today. For those of you that haven't come across me, I'm Global Victoria's Trade Manager for Technology based in the US, and I lead our support for Victorian technology companies as they enter and grow their businesses in this market. Thank you to everyone for joining us for the second session of this webinar series focused on the US cybersecurity landscape. Thanks to Michael for moderating, and I want to echo his thanks for all of the speakers too. I'd also like to thank my colleague here in DC, the Victorian Government's Director for Defence and Aerospace in the Americas, Karen Loughran, and to our colleagues in the Defence team for getting this session off the ground. Karen and the team are a great resource for companies looking to work with the US defence industry, and I would encourage any company that is interested in this industry to look into the activity that they deliver for Victorian companies in the US. As those of you who joined our first webinar will know, this series is part of a wider cybersecurity initiative for the US that Global Victoria is delivering in the first half of 2025. Our hope for this initiative is to provide more flexible in-market support for cybersecurity companies than could be provided by a traditional trade mission model. The webinar series itself consists of 4 sessions, with each session focusing on a theme or issue relevant to Victorian cybersecurity companies in the US market. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for the final 2 sessions where we will host discussions with corporate cybersecurity stakeholders and key cybersecurity clusters in the US. But today we're going to hear insights from the US defence industry and how cybersecurity companies can position themselves to do business in that industry. Thanks again to our speakers, and I hope you'll enjoy the session. I'll now hand you back to Michael to get on with the discussions.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you again for facilitating this webinar. I believe everyone will find it fairly insightful. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker this morning, Millie Keating. Millie is on the Defence Council board, and she'll be providing us an overview of the US defence industry and providing insights into what Victorian cybersecurity companies need to do to successfully sell to the US defence industry. Millie is not only a board member at DCV, but she's also a director at Mission Solutions at US headquarters Fluor Corporation. I think I might have got that completely wrong, but that's okay. So welcome, Millie. You want to give us, I suppose, a bit of context about? I haven't properly sold what you do. Would you like to give us a bit more about yourself, and I suppose, in particular in the defence sector, how it relates to, I suppose, Australia and US interactions?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning / evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Millie Keating, I am from a company called Fluor, big US EPCM, engineering, procurement and construction management organisation, but I lead what is called Mission Solutions, which is the government-focused business. My role really has us expanding what is traditionally a US government focus into the Australian government. But today I'm mainly here in my capacity as a Victorian Government Defence Council of Victoria board member. So the board is about 8 people. We're led by a wonderful lady, Dr. Regina Cremeri, who is a former Defence Science and Technology leader. She's also worked with Austrade and various other government entities with a real focus on science, technology, engineering and mathematics, workforce development and other key areas. As a member of the committee, we support Regina and the Victorian defence industry from an advisory capacity, looking at defence investment opportunities and developing strategies to pursue them. In addition to my role with Floor, I guess for everyone's benefit, I'm going to call it now and let you know I am not a cybersecurity expert, but I am a defence person. So I've been in the sector for about 15 years, including within government. I was part of the Defence Material Organisation back when it was in its current form. I spent a number of years with KPMG advising various clients on their defence strategies, including the Defence Department and strategic procurement and industrial policy. And then a number of years prior to Floor, I was with a Korean business called Hanwha Defence, and I helped mobilise that entity here in Australia. But to Michael's question around the context, so I don't think it's a surprise for people to hear that the threat environment is increasing, both in Australia and overseas. And in part, that has to do with AUKUS, the trilateral security partnership that was entered into a few years ago now between Australia, the US and the UK. That certainly brings opportunities, particularly for companies on this call who want to do business in those other countries. There are lots of initiatives in motion to make it easier to move technology between these nations. But it also increases threats because as a trilateral security partnership, we present potentially as a threat to others. So we are seeing increased risk of cyber espionage, foreign adversary, foreign actors, cyber attacks. We see it in the media most days, but at a defence level and a national security level, that presents a whole new level of threat. So the Australian Department of Defence have a number of initiatives in place. The Essential 8 was developed by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre a few years ago, and we're now seeing that implementation heightening within the Australian government's security program, which is called the Defence Industry Security Program, and we are seeing a similar thing in the US. So the US have already got quite stringent security requirements, but now we're seeing a transition to the cybersecurity maturity model certification system, which will see industry assessed on their levels of compliance, and that will be ongoing monitoring for anyone with a US government contract. All of that means uplift to businesses wanting to work with the US government in a similar way to those wanting to work with the Australian government. But what we have to remember is the opportunity is significant. If we look at cybersecurity in the US alone, of the US military's $900 billion worth of funding, $30 billion is going into cybersecurity initiatives. That's pretty substantial, and that's just one fiscal year. Cybersecurity is a key element of US defence planning. That makes sense. And the US, if we in Australia think we're at threat, the US sees it at a whole new level. It's also important to remember that selling to a US customer is a great credential for back here in Australia. The US is still seen as a preeminent customer, so targeting opportunities in that market, whether it's into a prime like Leidos or directly, has huge benefits for your company selling back at home and other countries around the world. Sorry, Michael, that was a very long context setting.
No, you've done an amazing job there, and thank you for that insight. So I did have a couple of questions, and you've actually covered off the first one about the defence security requirements, so we can skip over that one. I suppose my other question or other questions are in terms of Victorian companies, have you seen much success, I suppose, across Victorian organisations, working inside the US defence industry?
Yeah, absolutely. From a general defence perspective, we've seen some really significant success stories in the likes of Morand and AW Bell, who have provided components into large global programs, such as the Joint Strike Fighter program. So that's a Lockheed Martin aerospace program. Looking specifically at cybersecurity, companies like those we've got on the call today, Senetas, who provide high-speed network encryption solutions. They've had some success selling solutions into the US Defence Force, and I'm sure the team will speak more about that shortly. Sentient Vision, another Victorian company, while focused on a different vertical of software, also has had some success in the US. But the other angle is US investors. And again, Leidos is on the call. They can speak more to this later on. But they've set up their first software factory in Melbourne outside of the US. So that tells us something about the strength of the workforce and the industrial capacity that we have here in the state.
Awesome. That's great. I suppose for organisations that are operating inside of Victoria and wanting to break into the US industry. I'll ask my next two questions together because I think they're kind of interlinked. So I suppose the question that becomes is, what support did you see, I suppose, Victorian government is able to offer companies, to break into the US and I suppose, fulfill their ambitions to become global companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Victorian government has a cyber strategy they released a few years ago, which seeks to position Victorian industry as a global leader in cybersecurity, particularly around those workforce and innovation aspects. Karen is also on the call today, Karen Loughran, who is based in the US. She's focused on assisting Victorian companies break into the US. Her role in the agency is the Director of Defence and Aerospace, and she's supported by who did our opening as a technology manager. There are some specific initiatives that the Victorian government is looking at to support the cybersecurity market, particularly around how to expand and grow in the US market. There's also opportunities to get involved in events in the US. So CS Space is a major conference that's held annually. We take a delegation over there, as well as the Special Operations Forces Week.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. And I suppose then the second part of that question I was trying to dovetail in was, I suppose, do you have, with your extensive experience, any, I suppose, advice that we could share with those on the webinar about how to break into the US market and, I suppose, be able to expand their capabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, and this advice applies to anyone trying to break into a new market. Identify where you fit in the supply chain. Is your product or service something that a prime would deliver to the ultimate customer, being the US government, as part of a system? And is a Leidos or is a Boeing, are they your target? Or do you have an offering that you believe you can sell directly into a US government department or agency? Working that out, it sounds simple, but working that out can be challenging because it does depend on the compliance requirements to deliver into that contract, the flow of money, whether or not you've got certain systems in the US versus hosted in Australia. So there's a bit to understand in order to position yourself in the supply chain. And to better understand that, talk to Victorian government leaders, talk to others in the sector. Not every engagement has to be about the ultimate sale, but you could learn a lot by talking with stakeholders in and around the sector who've had success and learning from their experience. The other thing I would say is understanding the tickets to play, as I like to call them. What minimum requirements must you meet in order to supply to a prime or into the US government? It might be a certification, it might be security clearances for your people, but until you find out those things, it's going to be hard to understand what you need to do to be at the starting line. And, Fluor is a massive company, but we're seeing that now trying to break into the Australian market. There are certifications that we need that we don't have, that we need to make sure are in place before we can even respond to a tender. And finally, this saying that I hear a bit, separated by a common language. We all speak the same language in Australia and the US, but sometimes what we say has a different meaning. So don't be afraid to ask those questions and seek clarification, particularly in such a high-tech sector. Understanding the nuances in the meaning is really important. That would be what I would suggest.
Thank you so much, Millie. That's amazing insight, and really thank you for your time and sharing your space expertise with us. Thank you very much.
No worry. Thank you.
No worries. So moving on then into the next section of the webinar, we're going to be speaking with the team from Leidos Australia. So I'd love to introduce David Hyams, and he is going to start, I suppose, talking about major supply chain partners and how they work with solution providers and other defence stakeholders in the cybersecurity space. So David, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, as said, my name is David Hyams. I'm the head of cyber operations. That doesn't mean I run the SOCs. It means I run all cyber operations. So anything that's delivered into customer sites either has my oversight or my input. I have prepared some slides which hopefully will head off some of the questions and give you a little bit more information. So Leidos is a global tech company solutions leader, but that doesn't mean we just provide into the Department of Defence. We have several divisions. Defence is just one of them. We have intelligence services, and I work for the commercial and international division, which means it's essentially all the other services outside of the US rolled up into one, plus provision to banks and other service providers in the US. Areas we really focus on are mission critical systems, cyber and digital transformations, defense logistics support, and secure software development. Slide, please. So what I will focus on today is US defense primes, of which Leidos is considered one of the prime systems integrators. Lockheed Martin's another, Boeing. There's a few more. But what we do as a defense prime is act as a industry partner. We do all the capability development for them. We do all the research and development. We provide services such as cyber and information security. And again, we also deal with the supply chains and in the industrial space support. We also do work around force readiness and operational support. This isn't something that most people are aware of, but even here in Australia, we provide a lot of chemical, nuclear, biological training to the Australian Defence Force, and we support them all through that. Slide, please. So focusing purely on the US, we have 40,000 US employees, 7,000 of which are cyber personnel or work in what we call the cyber family. We have over $1 billion annual revenue just from pure cyber activities. That doesn't include revenue from contracts where cyber forms a part of the contract. These are pure cyber, like running SOCs for the White House, for instance. We do run 3 of the largest SOCs, and we also run a private lab for certifying security products. And we own several patents. You can see there that our large government partners, some of the biggest departments in the US. And slide, please. So this is of great interest to Australian partners. So AUKUS and ITAR. If you've ever dealt with the exporting or importing anything, ITAR is an extremely painful point, and it's always a point of contention. AUKUS is allowing us to bypass some of the more onerous restrictions, and we're able to export or import technologies that governments would previously have blocked. Key areas we're looking at are artificial intelligence, autonomy, cyber, hypersonics. So Leidos actually has part of hypersonics program, which has proven very successful, and we'll actually be receiving some of those technologies in the near future. Electronic warfare, and there's a couple of areas that we're not so interested in Australia, being the undersea capabilities and quantum sciences. You'll see in that picture, that is the Sea Hunter. Those are two fully autonomous naval vessels, US Navy vessels, built by Leidos. Those drove from the US to Australia with no humans on board. And that's them coming into Sydney Harbour for a presentation to the Australian Navy last year. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the export success requirements. These are, as said before, the tickets to play. For Australian export, you need to be a member of the DISP, otherwise the Australian federal government may not support you. You need to comply with the export control laws. There's the defence and strategic good lists. You need to apply for permits, and then you need to undergo through all the US import and export control compliance. Those are nebulous and changing at the moment. So our import-export team is currently trying to understand that. You need to align with the US security standards. So the US doesn't use the ISM, the Essential 8. They have NIST, they have the CMMC2, they have DFARS. If you don't align with those, you are not able to provide services into US government. And then the US DoD has its own contracting requirements on top. And they've got inbuilt supply chain security and reporting requirements. Now, if you'd like to supply into Leidos, we'll help you with a lot of that. And I've included the link on the screen. Slide, please. So the current threats that we're seeing, no change really. It's supply chain attacks, it's 0 days, cloud and AI security risks. The US federal government uses FedRAMP clouds, but they're still susceptible. There's a lot of operational technology and infrastructure threats that are coming through. Ransomware continues to be an issue. And then the emerging ones are actually not really ones that anyone knows how to counter yet, but deep fakes. There's been cases of deep fake video conferences such as this with AI generated people that look and sound exactly like the personnel that they're duplicating, and it's causing contractual issues, it's causing financial issues as people are transferring money because their boss literally told them to, and it looks and sounds exactly like them, and if they're relaying it correctly, it looks like it comes from the right place. And we are seeing more and more AI-driven cyber attacks. If you set up DeepSeek in a local configuration, it doesn't have any safety boundaries around it, and it's quite happy to give you whatever code you ask it for. Slide, please. So this is how we're countering it. We're being proactive. We're focusing on our supply chain. That includes any suppliers into our supply chain. We're keeping ahead using cyber threat intelligence. We're collaborating. We test ourselves. We test ourselves religiously. Even our internal phishing attacks are so legitimate looking that it's making people somewhat paranoid. And then we make sure that we comply, and our compliance with regulatory authorities is quite complicated because we have 3 countries that we have to comply with, and all 3 of those have differing requirements and differing standards, which introduces some siloing issues. Next slide, please. That should be the end of it. Excellent.
Oh, awesome. Thank you very much. That's super duper insightful. I've got a couple of questions before we move into, I see there is one question. So if anyone else has any questions, feel free to jump on board. We've got some time put aside for questions from the audience. So particularly, I suppose, in relation to Leidos itself, how do you find and determine which cybersecurity solutions providers to engage? What does that, I suppose, process look like?
So there's 2 different ways. In the US, there's an annual supplier conference, which is quite large. and it runs for 2 days in Las Vegas, around the same time as Black Hat traditionally. And what happens is that's where you can try and sell yourself to our executive and to the solution architect. In Australia, you register yourselves as an Australian partner. We'll reach out and have conversations, and then we'll work with you to uplift anything that needs to be uplifted, and we'll include you. So I do quite a bit of business development work. I work closely with the solution architects to make sure that we're putting forward secure solutions. And I work very closely with a number of our suppliers. And if it's not myself, it's one of the other very senior security people inside Leidos.
Awesome. And I suppose, how do the different countries work together on innovation procurement? Is that kind of done region by region, or is that more of a global focus?
It depends on there's a couple of factors to that. Who's paying? If the US government's paying, they do not want that shared outside of the US. If it's an internal research and development project, we work very closely together. And realistically, it comes down to what's legally allowed and what's not. If it's customer data, it's not allowed to be offshored in any of the 3 major countries that we service. If we're paying, we collaborate because we like the follow the sun model of development.
Awesome. And I suppose, sort of following on from that sort of point you made, I suppose, are there any differences between the way that Leidos engages, I suppose, with the defence industries between the US and Australia?
Yeah, it does differ. Obviously in Australia, we don't have the scale, we don't have the, Australian companies can't meet the same level of rigor as what US companies do. Some of the companies we deal with in the US have teams of compliance people that exceed the number of personnel in an organization in Australia. That scale difference needs to be recognized and realized. It would be unfair if I was to drop CMMC 2.0 on an Australian customer or an Australian supplier and say, you need to comply with this. So yeah, we do differ, and we're a lot more friendly in Australia because we're trying to improve the AIC.
Awesome. And what are some of the first steps you might advise, I suppose, specifically Victorian cybersecurity companies to take when they're thinking about, how to sell their products or solutions over to the US defence industry?
So talk to Global Victoria, but there's also the US federal agencies that I've mentioned earlier. They'll be able to help you actually recognize what you need to do, especially if you're working in somewhere like Senetas does in encryptors. There are laws around the export of encryption software, etc. And if you run afoul of those, it's very unpleasant.
That sounds like definitely need to be considering that then. And what are some of the key differences, I suppose, in the ways that businesses and is done in the defence industry, and especially again in the context of between Australia and the United States?
So the contracting methods between Australia and the US are completely different, and how defence primes are engaged by the federal governments completely differs as well. Australian Department of Defence love fixed firm price, whereas US Department of Defence prefers cost plus, because that allows for them to change scope on the fly. This then affects how we as Leidos interact with subcontractors and suppliers, because the company, we're massively exposed if it's a fixed firm price contract and we don't have the same fixed firm price contract downstream. Whereas cost plus allows a lot more flexibility, which allows for promising threads to be followed right through to their natural conclusion.
Okay, awesome. And the last one for me before we go to the Q&A from the audience is, do you see any particular advantages for Australian companies in regards to, I suppose, being able to position themselves inside, I suppose, the US market?
What I will say is have a really strong use case and a unique selling point. You need to overcome the US government's America First policies, much like in Australia, you have an advantage here because Australia First policies. So if you have a unique selling point, something that the US itself doesn't currently have or is unable to procure onshore, then yes, 100% you have a very, very strong advantage. Your secondary advantage comes through that AUKUS Pillar 2 is now in effect, and organisations such as ourselves have actually already trailblazed through that, so that we now know that you can import and export smoothly under that, and we've worked out the kinks for you.
Perfect. That's great. I'll go into a question from the audience. So the question is, what's the best way to check if someone can be a subby to Leidos and get small project work and understand the requirements of what to expect in terms of delivery quality?
What I will drop into the chat is basically these are the two registration portals. So these are how suppliers can do business with Leidos in the US and how and the supply partner network that we have here in Australia. These are the best ways to contact us because that will get you onto our approved supplier lists, and from there we'll be able to engage with you and work out how best we can partner.
Awesome. And as a follow-up question, how can we check if our platform is of value? We think Leidos can assist us in becoming a partner vendor and that vetting process.
We'd have to go through a business development process. So engage with us through the partner portal, and then we'll have to sit down, have concept demonstrators, discussions, commercial discussions, and see if there's anything that we can assist from there. It's a complicated question, sorry.
No, all good. For companies that have so far focused on commercial industries, do you have any tips for anyone who might want to move into the defence industry?
Yes. Defence industry is very, very different to commercial. I spent many, many years in the Australian Defence Force, and we used to laugh quite a lot when anyone would say military grade and then use that to mean cutting edge. Military grade actually means usually older technology that has proven itself to be absolutely rock solid. It will not fail under any circumstances, despite being, 55 degrees outside and muddy. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand or make that change. The risk acceptance for defence is a lot lower than the risk acceptance for commercial. There is a reason why the ISM, particularly once you start looking at secret controls, is a lot stricter than people's personal information.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for your time, David. It's been really insightful, and I would expect everyone has found that of I suppose great use. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Have a great day.
All right, we're going to move across over to Senetas now. So I'd like to introduce Andrew Wilson and Julian Fay, who are both from Senetas, and they're going to be going through a discussion on doing business in the US defence sector, and I suppose providing some insights as to best practices for engaging with the industry. So Julian and Andrew, over to you.
All right. Well, let me kick off by introducing Senetas. For 25 years, Senetas has been developing and designing high-assurance, quantum-ready encryption solutions. We've supplied our technology to over 60 different countries around the world during that 25-year history, including the US federal government, which is one of our longest-standing customers. It's obviously the subject of this webinar. Our solutions are trusted, protect sensitive data in motion, ensuring security without compromising network performance. We also supply end-to-end network security and file sharing products and cloud security products. We are based in Melbourne. All of our engineers and designers are based in Melbourne. It's manufactured in Australia, which I think is important for many of our government customers around the world. So that's a short intro to Senetas, and let's dive into some of the questions because it tells a really good story about Senetas's journey over the last 25 years.
Yes, certainly sounds like sort of an interesting, I suppose, organisation and space to be in. So, can you tell us a little bit about your US journey, and I suppose when you started to explore the possibilities of the US market?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to hand that question across to Julian, who is one of the founding engineers of this technology and was around at the time that we began this journey.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everybody. Great to be here with you today. Yeah, so the Senetas journey started about 25 years ago when we were a three-person startup. It was a time when communication networks were evolving from mostly sort of low-speed copper network infrastructure and about to transition to higher-speed fiber optic backbones. And we saw that there was going to be a requirement to provide encryption across those higher capacity networks. So three of us got together and we came up with a product which we developed. The problem was that we had an idea for a technology, but not many customers other than a couple of people in Australia who were somewhat interested. So honestly, the way we got started in the US was we basically started emailing everybody that we could think of who might possibly have an interest in the technology we built. And we were lucky that we got a response fairly quickly from Thales, the big French defense company. And they told us that the US Defense Department was building a high-speed fiber optic infrastructure and that they had a security requirement for that. So that really kicked off what became a 2-year journey of going over to Washington, Virginia, firstly working with our partner Thales. They had some great contacts into the heart of the US Defense Agency, particularly those who were building networks. They introduced us in there, and we were able to build a direct relationship with some of the sort of key architects in the US defense system. And they gave us some requirements for what they wanted to achieve, which was pretty much aligned with what we were doing, which was great. Problem was there was a US competitor, and we kind of thought, well, how is a small Australian company going to stand a chance when there's actually a US competitor? But neither company had the exact requirements that met the US Defense Department's needs. So I remember there was one particular example where they needed an ability to remotely manage these network encryption appliances that we built. And neither us nor our US competitor had an offering. And we came back and our team, I remember we actually went out to the country and we spent the whole weekend sort of working on building this feature. And about 3 weeks later, we were back in Washington able to demonstrate it to the customer. And I think that willingness to kind of be very reactive, to be able to build those relationships with the right people really helped us. And shortly after, we got our first order, which was to protect a high-speed network around the Asia-Pacific region connecting US defense bases. And our small team had to scramble. We basically gave up Christmas that year. We had to all go down to the factory and help screw in the devices. But it was really the kickoff to 25 years of being able to supply great Victorian technology into the US Defense Department.
That sounds incredible. I think sort of being at the grassroots of it, would have been quite the experience. I suppose the next question is, I suppose, then starting to ask whether or not you had actually done any other overseas markets before going to the US, or whether you went straight from Australia to the US market.
Straight from Australia to the US market. It was a small team, a small company at the time. Yeah. And obviously, strategically, it makes sense to break into the US market if you can.
Awesome. And what industries did you target during your early growth in the US market, I suppose, outside of the initial use case as you started to expand?
Well, over that time, obviously, critical infrastructure, government agencies concerned with critical infrastructure and energy, financial institutions globally, obviously security-aware organisations are some of our sort of core customers, and later in life, some of the large cloud providers such as Salesforce and Microsoft and Oracle.
Yep. And I mean, I suppose you spoke earlier about your first engagement and I suppose how that came about. So I suppose how long did that take? Like from start to finish. What did that process look like in terms of time?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It was between 1 and 2 years. Once we started engaging, I mean, we're in Melbourne, a very long way away from where the action was happening. So we suddenly, we had a little office in Ashburton out in suburban Victoria. And suddenly we found that we were on a plane to Virginia every 6 to 8 weeks, because you had to be there working directly with the people. So it probably took, before we got that first order, was probably 18 to 24 months, I'd say. But there was a lot of work in the interim of kind of building relationships and understanding what the customer actually needed from us.
Yeah, awesome. And what does that sales cycle look like for you now? I suppose now that you've got a good foothold and you've been around for 25 years, does that sales cycle look any different, or is it similar?
Well, for those existing US government customers, the sales cycle is quite short. It depends on what's changing the network infrastructure and budgeting cycle. So it is shorter once you've acquired a customer. But new customers in various parts of the world, and depending on where in the world that new customer resides, it can range anywhere from 1 year to 4 years. And the Middle East particularly has long sales cycles.
And sorry, just for context, what other I suppose countries do you now sell into or operate into?
60 different countries around the world, including many Middle Eastern countries, a lot of European countries, Latin America, Canada, obviously Australia and New Zealand, and many Asian countries as well, including Singapore. Yeah, 60 different countries around the world. So that initial success with the US government, you really transformed Senetas at the time into a global company. Yeah, great. And I suppose, what would you say then in terms of the US defence industry in particular, and how that differs maybe from, I suppose, other markets and also other geographies as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, because we're in the encryption space, we're very much driven by compliance, as the other speakers mentioned earlier. So we have to go through. We have a certification team. Unfortunately, it's one person, so we don't have the resources of some of those US companies, and we have to get the cryptographic certifications the US government needs, which are things like FIPS, common criteria, and they are time consuming. Each certification cycle takes at least a year. Expensive. They're very expensive and they're problematic. But once you get those, they do provide a bit of a moat for you, because it is, as we said, difficult to get them. There are some quite high technical hurdles. And the landscape is constantly changing. What we're seeing right now is that there are some new requirements that are becoming table stakes to have solutions adopted by the US Defense Department. But the counter side to that is, I think once you can get in and you can prove the value of your offering, then it is quite sticky. If your product is really delivering value, then that customer will continue to buy it. We've had some devices that have been running in there for more than a decade, and they keep coming back and buying more. So it can be great once you're in.
Yeah, so Julian's just emphasising the importance of making sure that if you're an Australian company and you have a product or a service, that you have the necessary certifications to sell into government agencies, not just in the US but around the world.
Yeah, that's great insight. And I suppose sort of following in on insight, is there any recurring themes or I suppose narratives that you've sort of seen with what solutions are most interest inside I suppose the US defence space?
Well, I think obviously with the threat of quantum computing on the horizon, certainly a lot of attention and focus has been given to ensuring that encryption solutions, for example, are quantum ready, and other solutions are quantum ready for the impending threat. So that is a focus of not just the US Department of Defense, but government agencies around the world and increasingly commercial organizations. So that's both a threat and an opportunity.
Yeah, it's a bit of a strange dynamic. It's kind of simultaneously the most sort of dynamic technical environment in the world, but also the most conservative as well in some regards. So, there's a lot of new technologies obviously that are being adopted now, particularly around AI and quantum. But yet, we have customers who, to be frank, are running on older versions of software than they should, because they don't have the resources internally to migrate to the latest technology. So there can be some kind of bureaucracy and incumbency there that sort of is a bit of an anchor on innovation. So it's a strange mix of both of those worlds.
Yeah, right. And I suppose, you know, you did, I suppose, talk about, I suppose, threats. So I suppose my next question was going to be specifically for Australian organisations. Are there any, I suppose, specific opportunities or challenges that you see for Australian organisations engaging inside the US defence sector?
I mean, my advice to any Australian organisation would be try and find a partner like Leidos or Talos or one of the big primes who already understands how to supply to the US Department of Defence. I think that is my strong advice to any Australian company, rather than trying to engage directly with US Department of Defence, which I think would be incredibly difficult. For example, although an Australian organisation may have cleared staff, they're not cleared in the United States. And so having discussions directly where it relates to sensitive information can be extremely difficult. And with a Leidos or a Talos or a Northrop Grumman or a Raytheon will already have US cleared staff that can have those discussions on your behalf.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I think Australians are very highly regarded in the US, in the defence sector. I think from the first day when we first started engaging, I never felt we were at a disadvantage because we were from Australia. In fact, if anything, it probably made us a little bit more interesting and quirky, and they were interested in what we were doing. And I would, as Andrew said, I think having the right partner is absolutely key. In our case, we got very lucky early on having some key individuals who were able to take us right in and build direct relationships with the customer. I know that's not always possible because you do have to go through partners and distributors and system integrators, etc. But I would encourage organizations to get as close to the customer as they possibly can through that partner to actually really understand what is driving the customer's requirements, both in the short term and the long term, because that can really help dictate your product roadmap as well as your marketing and business strategy.
Yeah, awesome. And I suppose I'll ask, if you had a crystal ball in the corner over there, or you could get in a time machine, what is the one thing you both wish you knew when you first started working in the US defence space?
That's a tough question.
I wish I didn't know how hard it was going to be and how you had to sort of persevere. I think the ability to kind of persist and keep going, you know, battling through the hurdles when they sometimes seem pretty insurmountable is a kind of key characteristic of being successful, which is true in life in general, I guess. But
and just adding to that, obviously, the certification process is extremely expensive, extremely arduous, and changes all the time. And that's an ongoing challenge that I think we didn't anticipate, the complexity of those certifications, the expense of those certifications. And I would advise any company that is looking to develop a product to develop that product with those certifications in mind from the ground up.
Yeah. And you need to spend time on the ground there. You really can't do this completely remotely. You really need to get over there, build relationships, and keep them refreshed. That's critical.
So that means Julian and I travel a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like you spend quite a bit of time, on planes. And I must say, your crystal balls must work very, very well. That's the best answer I've ever had to a crystal ball question. Thank you, guys. That's the end of my questions. And you've actually done such a great job. You've answered one of the questions already from the audience, which was in regards to local partners and whether you went direct or whether you had local support. So thank you very much for covering it off in detail. There's another question. How do changes in administration shape the way you engage with the US defence industry, if at all, or whether it relies on sort of a major shift in sort of how you approach things?
Yeah, I mean, never say never, because obviously politics is a dynamic thing. But having the right partner is critical to ensure that you can navigate the changes in policy. And so that's what we're focused on. We pray as well.
In general, you're kind of insulated. I would say over the last 25 years, I felt we've been insulated from administration changes. It might be a little bit different this time, perhaps. We'll have to wait and see what unfolds over the coming months. Yeah. In general, the change of administration really relates mostly to budget, because a lot of departments will freeze budgets like they do in Australia if there's a change of government.
Yeah, and we're also a part of the Five Eyes community as well. So from that perspective, there's that Five Eyes Alliance, and so we are a trusted partner of the United States government, and so that obviously helps Australian companies in dealing with successive US government changes.
Yep, awesome. I've got another question. It's an interesting one, actually. Is building your solutions on, I suppose, industry standard solutions like Microsoft Entra or those kinds of platforms? Is that is that a good approach, do you feel? And does that help you get around some of the compliance and certification issues?
So we build standalone infrastructure appliances. What we've done over the last few years is try to tightly couple those into particularly government cloud infrastructures that help us. So there's something called FedRAMP in the US, which is the federal government approved cloud. Because we had a FIPS certification for our products, that meant we picked up a lot of business in some of the sort of hyperscale cloud providers who were offering FedRAMP services. So I think as a strategy, aligning yourselves to the technology that the government is using absolutely makes sense. But again, early on, we had a technology-driven approach and trying to, if we build it, will they come kind of strategy? And we got lucky. We built it and they did come. I would really encourage people to kind of understand what customers actually need moving forward in this rapidly changing environment and making sure that what they are developing is adding value.
Yep, awesome. And someone has actually asked a question that I suppose is a little bit of a riff on the crystal ball question. And I suppose if you had your time over again during the early stages of that journey, would you do anything different?
Probably not. Probably not. I'm sure we made mistakes along the way, but it's been an incredible journey and a great Australian story.
We've had fun. I think it was a combination of luck. Seeing an opportunity at the right time, and that product did fit a market need at the time. But let's be honest, there's a lot of luck involved in these things as well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, awesome! Thank you so very much for your time and your insight. It's been a great chat, and love hearing about good Australian success stories as well. So thank you very much for sharing.
No problem.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the session. So I'd like to obviously, first of all, a very, very big thank you to all of our speakers, Millie, David, and Andrew and Julian, who we just had. And I think in sort of closing, it certainly sounds like there's some amazing organisations, Australian and Victorian organisations, operating in and around the US defence space. Obviously, Millie has given us a great overview of, what happens in regards to Defence Council Victoria and how they can support. Leidos has given us some really good views into, I suppose, how the major supply chain partners work and interact, especially between Australia and US organisations. And Senetas is just, it's a great story, and one that I hope many other organisations can I suppose emulate as well. So I'd love to hand back over to Troy, I believe, and thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and good morning all. For those of you I'm yet to meet, my name is Troy too, and I'm a trade manager within the technology, health and sport team at Global Victoria. On behalf of Global Victoria, I'd like to thank our Victorian cybersecurity community for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Michael and the Australian Information Security Association for moderating today's session and all of the speakers who contributed. As previously mentioned, this was the second in our 4-part webinar series. You can find a recording of our first session, an introduction to the US market, on the webinar registration page, and I'll also place a recording of today's session on this page. We have a bit of a hiatus in the webinar series for now, but I encourage you to register for our next session and join us 1 month from today. This session will focus on reaching corporate decision makers in the US market. Kirsten McIntosh from Something Real Ventures will moderate this session, And Kirsten will be joined by some key US CISOs who will outline the issues they're currently facing and insights into best practice building relationships with US clients. Dan should have by now placed a link to the webinar registration page in the chat so you can register, but I'll also follow up with participants for today's session with an email as well. I look forward to connecting you with regarding your broader export plans, and Dan and Karen are available in our Washington, D.C. office should you be ready to take that first step or increase your engagement in the US. To close, I encourage you to go in with eyes wide open and make the most of any resources available to you, particularly when investigating the defence industry. As you saw today, there's a lot to navigate. If you're thinking about targeting US defence, I hope this session has provided you with ideas for a course of action. And if you already play in that space, I hope today has reaffirmed some of your thinking or opened a new avenue for you to explore. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.